Hola, buenos días. Yo soy Bob White. Yo hablo español, pero un poco no mucho. Entonces yo hablo inglés, por favor. So, I am going to be talking about a part of this diplomado, a part that will focus on basically the definition and an example of ethical and social responsible behavior in the energy sector. So I'm going to start first by looking at what is social responsibility. So the best place to look for the definition of social responsibility is in the ISO 26000 standard that I was part of developing along with 500 people from over 100 countries, including Mexico. And one of the other presenters here, Lilia Guarino-Vasquez, is also was a member of that committee writing ISO 26000. So ISO 26000 defines social responsibility as accepting responsibility for the impacts of our decisions and activities on society and the environment through ethical behavior that is consistent with sustainable development and the welfare of society, takes into account the expectations of stakeholders, is in compliance with the applicable law and consistent with international normative behavior, and is integrated throughout the organization. Now, that's the basis of ethical and social responsible behavior. So when you look at the behavior of any organization, and those in the energy sector especially, because of the significant impact they could have on the environment and society, then this is a good place to start with this definition. Okay, so I was talking about ethical behavior, which is the basis of social responsibility. So if you look or drill down into what is ethical behavior, you find that for organizations to behave in an ethical manner is to promote ethical behavior based on the values of honesty, equity, and integrity, and their commitment to address the impact of their activities and decisions on society and the environment. By identifying and stating its core values and principles, and second, by developing and using governance structures to ensure that ethical behavior is followed throughout the organization, by identifying, adopting, and applying standards of ethical behavior taken from international normative behavior, by defining and communicating the standards of ethical behavior it expects from all of its stakeholders, employees, suppliers, anyone that has an effect or is affected by the organization, and by preventing or resolving conflicts of interest throughout the organization that could lead to unethical behavior. Number 6, finally, establishing and maintaining oversight mechanisms and control to monitor, support, and enforce ethical behavior. The 7th then is to establish and maintain mechanisms to facilitate the reporting of unethical behavior without fear of reprisal. And I think that's an important aspect, that people, there needs to be a mechanism set up in the organization so if people want to report unethical behavior, they can do so without being exposed or without suffering because they are reporting it. Number 8 is recognizing and addressing situations where local laws and regulations do not exist, or they exist but they're in conflict with ethical behavior. And 9 is adopting and applying internationally recognized standards of ethical behavior. And finally, 10 is respecting the welfare of animals. So that defines ethical behavior. But when you stop to think of it, everybody thinks they are ethical. And they think they're ethical because they base their behavior on their values. So if their values are values of love and caring and support for humanity, for society, for the environment, then their behavior will be ethical based on those values. But if their values are to take what they can get, to steal or rob or cheat, then their behavior will be based on those values, and that behavior will not be ethical. So The other aspect of it, I believe that ethical behavior is timeless and universal. Timeless in that behavior that existed 200 years ago was ethical or not ethical, not based on the values of the time, but based on what society knew to be ethical. Timeless, so that's the timeless aspect. Universal in that behavior that is ethical in, say, Toronto, Canada, would be also ethical in Mexico City. So the challenges are that, again, if you look back 200 years ago when people owned slaves, the President of the United States owned slaves, society would have considered him to be ethical based on the values of the time. But was he ethical? Was he ethical by owning other people? If you ask the other people, the slaves that he owned, was he ethical because he owned them? I'm sure they would say no. So in spite of the values of the time, it does not make behavior ethical. And that applies 200 years ago, it applies today, and it'll apply in the future. The other aspect then is in terms of situation. Sometimes people believe that in their part of the world or their country or where they work, that doing unethical things like paying bribes or cheating or taking things from people, that those things are just part of the culture of society, and therefore they reflect ethical behavior, but they do not. Let me go then to the next slide and look at a foundation that society has had throughout time, virtually throughout time, and it's the golden rule. The rule that says we should do to others what we would have them do to us, and not do to them what we would not have them do to us. That's the golden rule that exists for thousands of years. Confucius wrote about it. It's in the Bible, it's in the Quran, it's in the Vedic, the Hindu books. It is a basic premise of all religions. Do to others as you would have them do to you, and do not do to others what you would not have done to you. That existed 200 years ago. If a person owned slaves, they then did not conform with that guideline, that golden rule that existed, and that was probably taught in their religious community. But the values of the time ignored that or found a way to interpret that differently. So if you look at the basic framework then of ethical behavior, it is based on the golden rule. If you look at the definition, accepting responsibility for the impacts of our decisions and activities on society and the environment through ethical and transparent behavior, again, it's similar to the golden rule. So these are not new concepts. They're just being codified in the standards. I talked about values of the time that sometimes are confused with ethical behavior. But if you look at the definition of values in many of the dictionaries, you'll find values defined as the established ideals of life. So what are people's ideals? What do they think are ideal for their life? And again, if it's to care and love and share, then those values are ethical. If it's to steal or take what you can get or feel entitled to have anything you want, then those would not be considered ethical. The next definition we need to look at then is moral and ethical. So moral and ethical is in agreement with a standard of what is right and good in character or conduct. What is right and good in character or conduct, think again about the golden rule. That's where you'll see that definition. And finally, ISO 26000 defines ethical behavior as behavior that is in accordance with accepted principles of right or good conduct in a context of a particular situation and consistent with international norms of behavior. When you move then to the next part of social responsibility, which was to be consistent with sustainable development, we need to look at the definition. And the best definition is the one taken from the Brundtland Commission. which is on sustainable development, written in 1987 by Madame Brundtland. But basically, she defined, or her group defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. When you think about things like energy, think about 2 or 3 generations from now. Will they have access to the energy that we have, the oil and gas, the propane, all of the different things that we have access to? Or will we consume it so that it does not exist in 50, 100 years? If that's the case, then what we're doing is not sustainable. So when you look at sustainable development, we need to look at, are the things we're doing today, are the choices we're making to use and consume resources, will those choices be available to future generations? That's the issue, that's the challenge of sustainable development. And with regard to energy, the answer is no, that most of what the things we're doing with regard to energy will not be available. People will have to find different sources of energy, and that's where renewable energies, that will probably be the future of energy. If you look at digging down into sustainable development, it talks about the environment. So from an environmental perspective, we need to produce less waste, support energy efficiency, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, support biodiversity, and use international standards like ISO 14001 to identify the impact we have on the environment and then to reduce that impact. From the other aspect of sustainable social development, we need to support door-to-door community outreach and plant tours that make sure that society knows what the organization is doing, engaging with them, developing. Support work-family-life balance programs that, such as flexible work hours, to allow employees to have a life outside of work, to recognize the value of a diverse workforce. From the economic aspect of it, we need to support local procurement so that we are sharing the benefit that we get from our organizations. We need to support local hiring, we need to support training and scholarship programs for people. So economic development and sustainable economic development applies to members of society that we have a responsibility to based on the impacts of our decisions and activities, based on the impacts of our organization. So basically that is, we're talking about the triple bottom line of corporate social responsibility or environmental, social, and governance. And there are many standards that, in order to meet that guideline, that we need to look at, such as UN Declaration of Human Rights, the International Labour Organization Declaration on the Fundamental Principles of Rights at Work, the Rio Declaration of Environment and Development, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and of course the UN Global Compact.